Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are hidden tea music in plain sight. Lying forgotten in an attic for nearly 150 years, a photograph from 1875 waited. Then, one day, a researcher decided to zoom in on something small. That's when everything shifted. What he uncovered wasn't merely strange, it was hay music impossible. And the truth he brought to light would compel historians to completely rethink their understanding of the people who risked everything to stand against injustice, when the rest of the world chose to look away. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button on this Cripio video. This is a story that needs to be shared. Out in rural Pennsylvania, an estate sale was taking place for a property that seemed entirely unremarkable. It was a modest farmhouse, built back in 1868, once home to a woman who'd outlived all her relatives. Now, before demolition, its contents were being cleared out. A furniture restorer named Marcus Rivera had come up from Philadelphia, hoping to find some antique pieces worth saving. Up in the attic, though, he found something that would end up consuming the next 8 months of his life entirely. Hidden behind an old broken rocking chair, sitting under layers of dust, was a metal lockbox, rusted shut. Inside, wrapped carefully in yellowed oilcloth, he found a collection of early photographs dating from the 1860s and 1870s. Most of them showed the kind of stern-faced families typical of the era, frozen stiffly in time. But one particular image stopped Marcus cold. In front of a simple wooden farmhouse, 6 people were posed. The parents were dressed in formal 1870s attire. The father wore a dark suit with a watch chain visible. The mother had on a high-collared dress. Standing between them were 3 white children, ranging in age from about 5 to 12. And there, right beside the eldest daughter, stood a black child. He looked no older than 8. His clothing was of identical quality to the others. His hand rested quite naturally on the girl's shoulder. He hadn't been placed at the edge of the frame or positioned slightly behind everyone else. He stood fully integrated into the group, as central to the composition as any blood relative would be. Marcus knew immediately why this image was so remarkable. Back in 1875, during that violent backlash against black freedom and the rise of Jim Crow, photographs showing this kind of racial integration simply did not exist in private family collections. This image suggested something far more layered than just a simple portrait. That evening, Marcus photographed the image and began studying it closely on his computer. Methodically, he zoomed in, examining the weathered farmhouse, the formal clothing, each individual face. Then his focus landed on the black child's left sleeve. There, embroidered just above the cuff, was a small geometric pattern. 3 interlocking diamonds, each one containing a star with lines radiating outward like compass points. The design was too precise to be random decoration, too deliberate to be meaningless. Marcus zoomed in closer still until the pattern filled his entire screen. His hands went still. His breath caught in his throat. He knew what he was looking at. This photograph was more than just a family portrait. It was a confession, a declaration, a piece of evidence that would unlock an extraordinary story of courage that had remained hidden for nearly 150 years. Marcus spent the entire night searching through digital archives and academic databases. The coffee pot was emptied twice as the darkness slowly shifted into dawn. Finally, buried deep within a 1987 Smithsonian research paper, he found his confirmation. Dr. Eleanor Price, a historian who specialized in textile communication systems, had written a controversial thesis. According to her research, the Underground Railroad hadn't simply stopped after the Civil War. Instead, throughout Reconstruction, the network had evolved. It continued helping formerly enslaved people escape escalating violence, reunite with family members they'd been separated from, and reach communities that were safe. And to do this, they developed new codes. The 3 interlocking diamonds, known as the beacon, signaled that a household was actively participating in the network. The stars inside each diamond indicated the capacity. 3 stars meant they could safely shelter 3 people at a time. But displaying a symbol like that so openly, especially in a photograph that could be reproduced, was an act of reckless defiance. These networks operated in complete secrecy. Conductors used code names. Safe houses were known only to trusted contacts. If discovered, the consequences could be violence or even murder. So why would any family take such a risk, exposing themselves like this on purpose? Marcus studied the photograph again. The positioning, the quality of the clothing, the calm, almost proud expression on the black child's face. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately created a permanent record, consequences be damned. In her footnotes, Dr. Price mentioned primary sources that were held at Haverford College, including papers from a family named Whitmore. Marcus checked the location of the estate sale. It was only 12 miles from Haverford. The timeline matched up. He called the college's archives department. Yes, they confirmed they did hold the Whitmore family papers, which included a diary kept by Ruth Whitmore from 1872 to 1889. Marcus made an appointment for the very next day. He couldn't sleep that night. He kept returning to the photograph, studying the boy's face, wondering who he was and how his life had become so deeply intertwined with this white family during one of America's most violent eras. The answer, when it came, would prove far more complex and heartbreaking than he ever could have imagined. The leather-bound diary was placed before Marcus, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. He opened it carefully to January 1st, 1872, and began reading Ruth Whitmore's precise, steady handwriting. The early entries documented routine farm life, the weather, the crops, news of neighbors. But scattered throughout were references that made Marcus's pulse quicken. Arrivals at midnight. Supplies hidden away in the cellar. Keeping a careful watch on the roads. Ruth never used explicit language, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Whitmores were operating a safe house throughout 1872 and into early 1873. She referenced multiple families passing through, staying for nights or even weeks before continuing further north. Ruth noted their fear, their exhaustion, their traumatized children. She documented Thomas Whitmore's growing concern about surveillance and the escalating violence around them. Then came August 14, 1873, the day that changed everything. Ruth described a boy, approximately 6 years old, appearing alone at their door near midnight. He was filthy, barefoot, and utterly terrified. He carried nothing with him except a scrap of fabric sewn into the lining of his coat, and on that scrap was embroidered their address. His name was Samuel. His mother had put him on a wagon heading north from North Carolina 3 weeks earlier. Armed men had stopped that wagon. Samuel had hidden beneath the supplies, escaped detection, and then stayed hidden. When the wagon finally reached Harrisburg, he slipped away and just started walking. He'd covered nearly 30 miles on his own. He was 6 years old. Ruth described cleaning his infected feet, listening to his whispered speech, noticing how he flinched at any sudden movement. Then she recorded the decision that would come to define Samuel's entire childhood. They weren't going to send him onward. He would stay. He would become their son. In the entries that followed, Ruth traced Samuel's slow integration into their family. His first words spoken above a whisper. His first genuine smile. The nightmares that haunted him. The gradual trust that began to build. Their daughter Mary teaching him his letters. But Ruth also documented the cost. Hostile neighbors. Merchants who refused them service. The word traitor painted on their barn in the night. Threatening letters arriving at their door. The Whitmores didn't waver. By December of 1873, Samuel had become family. He helped with chores, played with the other children, asked endless questions about everything. On March 3, 1875, Thomas made the decision to commission a family portrait. It wasn't a choice made lightly. Photographs were expensive, and this would create permanent, undeniable evidence of their defiance. In Ruth's final entry before the photographer arrived, she wrote, "Thomas has asked that I embroider the beacon onto Samuel's sleeve. I argued against such visibility, but he believes the truth should be documented. Let history judge us." The photograph session took place on March 10, 1875. A traveling photographer named William Archer charged 50 cents per sitting, completely unaware of what he was actually documenting. Ruth described the preparation in meticulous detail. She bathed all the children the night before, pressed their very best clothing, and then sat by candlelight, embroidering those 3 interlocking diamonds onto Samuel's sleeve. Each stitch carried an unbearable weight. That morning, the family assembled outside their house. The March weather was cold, but the skies were clear. Thomas positioned everyone carefully, himself on one side, Ruth on the opposite, the children arranged between them by height. Samuel stood right beside Mary, his first friend and most dedicated teacher. Archer prepared his camera, coating the glass plate with collodion, instructing them all to remain absolutely still. Any movement during the several-second exposure would blur the image. During those frozen moments, Ruth watched Samuel. He stood straighter than she'd ever seen him, his hand resting on Mary's shoulder exactly as he'd been positioned. He looked serious, but he wasn't afraid. For those few seconds, captured in chemistry and glass, he looked exactly like what he'd become, a child who truly belonged. 2 weeks later, Archer delivered the photograph. He made no comment at all about how the family was composed. Either he genuinely hadn't noticed, or he understood that staying silent was simply the price of doing business in such a divided community. Thomas immediately framed the picture and hung it in the parlor, visible to anyone who entered the house. It was a statement, a challenge, a declaration made visible for all to see. But the consequences came swiftly. Within days, men from town appeared at the farm, shouting accusations from the road. They accused Thomas of betraying his race, corrupting his own children, defying the natural order of things. They promised a reckoning was coming. Thomas stood on his porch, his rifle visible but not raised, and calmly told them to leave. The violence arrived gradually at first. Fences were cut. Crops were trampled. Their horse was found dead with its throat cut. There was never any proof, but everyone knew who was responsible. Through all of it, Ruth continued documenting Samuel's growth. He learned to read fluently. He helped repair fences. He asked questions about his mother, where she might be, whether she was still alive, whether she ever thought about him. These questions haunted Ruth. They had given Samuel safety, education, and love. But they couldn't give him what he needed most: knowledge of where he came from, and whether his mother was still out there searching for him. Then, in early 1876, changes came that Ruth could never have predicted. On February 9, 1876, heavy snow was falling. There was a knock at the door. Thomas answered to find a black woman standing on the porch. Her clothing was worn thin. Her face was gaunt with exhaustion and desperate, fragile hope. In barely a whisper, she asked if this was the Whitmore place, if they had taken in a boy named Samuel, if he was still alive. Ruth wrote that time itself seemed to stop. Thomas called for Samuel, who came running from the kitchen. The woman saw him, and her composure shattered completely. She spoke his name, just his name, and Samuel froze. He stared at her, his young mind processing, and then recognition sparked in his eyes. He ran to her with a cry that Ruth described as a heart simultaneously breaking and healing. Her name was Caroline. She had been searching for 3 years. Over the following days, Caroline told her story in fragments. She had been enslaved in North Carolina. She had raised Samuel from his birth in 1867. When rumors of emancipation reached the plantation, the owner threatened to sell them separately. A Quaker woman had helped arrange Samuel's escape on a wagon heading north, giving Caroline the Whitmore address. But Caroline herself couldn't go. She was too closely watched. She promised Samuel she would find him, made him memorize her name, put him on that wagon at midnight. That was the last time she saw him, until now. After the wagon left, Caroline was sold to South Carolina as punishment. When Union soldiers finally liberated that area, she just walked away with nothing. For 3 years she worked whatever jobs she could find, saving every penny, following any rumor she heard. Someone in Harrisburg had mentioned a white family who'd taken in a black child. She walked through snow and freezing rain, desperate with the hope that her son might still be alive. And he was. Ruth watched them together, something breaking open inside her own chest. Samuel clung to his mother, as if she might vanish at any moment. Caroline held him, weeping soundlessly, her hands trembling as they traced the lines of his face. But beneath the joy of reunion, Ruth recognized a complex truth beginning to emerge. Samuel had been 6 at the time of separation. He was now 9. Half his life had been spent with the Whitmores. He had no memory of his mother's face, only a sense of loss he could never quite articulate. Now she was here, real, asking him to remember who he'd been before. The unspoken question hung in the air, seemingly impossible to answer. What happens now? The weeks that followed documented a situation with no precedent, no easy answers. Caroline had found her son, but she had found nothing else. No home, no steady income, no way to provide for a child who had grown accustomed to safety and education. Ruth wrote about a kitchen conversation that took place while Samuel played outside. Caroline spoke with devastating honesty. She had dreamed of this reunion for 3 years, imagining the life they would finally build together. But reality was far harsher. She worked from dawn to dusk for wages that barely kept her alive, moving between boarding houses or sleeping in church basements when she had to. She asked Ruth a question that clearly cost her everything to voice. Could Samuel stay with them? Ruth told Caroline that Samuel belonged with his mother, that their bond was sacred. But she proposed an alternative, one that would honor both Caroline's love and Samuel's need for stability. Thomas and Ruth would continue housing Samuel during the week so he could keep attending school. Caroline would work in town, living in a room above the Methodist church, and every Sunday, Caroline would come out to the farm. They would share meals. They would have time together. When Caroline had saved enough for a proper home, Samuel would go with his mother. It was an imperfect and painful arrangement, asking Caroline to delay her hard-won reunion, asking Samuel to navigate 2 families and 2 identities. But it was the best solution available to them. Caroline agreed, weeping as she accepted, torn between gratitude and grief. The arrangement began the following week. Samuel attended school, helped with chores, slept in his familiar room. But Sundays became sacred. Caroline arrived at dawn, and in her presence, Samuel transformed. He was louder, more physical, more openly demonstrative. Ruth observed that with Caroline, Samuel allowed himself to be younger, more vulnerable. With the Whitmores, he had learned to be careful, controlled, always aware of how his very presence challenged the world around them. Ruth continued documenting their Sunday dinners, which now included both families. Thomas engaging Caroline in conversation about her work and her plans. Mary teaching Caroline to read with the same gentle patience she'd shown Samuel. The younger Whitmore children accepting Caroline's presence as something completely natural. The months passed, marked by small victories. Caroline's promotion to head laundress, which came with a cottage she could rent. Samuel's progress in mathematics, a gradual easing of hostility from the surrounding community. Not acceptance exactly, but a grudging tolerance born of the family's stubborn refusal to leave. In early 1878, Samuel asked whether he could have two mothers, whether loving Caroline meant he couldn't still love Ruth, whether belonging to two families was even possible. Thomas answered that love wasn't finite. Samuel's heart, he said, was large enough for everyone who truly cared for him. Family was defined by commitment and sacrifice, not just by blood. Samuel asked if he could call Ruth Mother Ruth and Caroline Mother Caroline. Both women agreed immediately. But beneath Ruth's composed exterior, a private diary entry revealed the complexity of her emotions. She had fallen deeply in love with this child. Raising him had fundamentally changed her understanding of what family could mean. Now she watched him build a relationship with his true mother, knowing that eventually, rightfully, he would leave. She described it as loving someone enough to let them go, even as it tore you apart inside. By 1879, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Federal troops withdrew from the South, bringing Reconstruction to an end. Jim Crow laws began spreading everywhere, codifying segregation and disenfranchisement. Violence against black communities escalated sharply. White families who openly supported racial equality faced severe consequences. Ruth documented the deterioration meticulously. The network that had operated throughout the 1870s began fragmenting. Conductors were arrested on fabricated charges. Safe houses were burned to the ground. Families who had risked everything found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. In January of 1880, the violence reached the Whitmore farm directly. 15 men arrived at dawn carrying torches, surrounding the house, shouting accusations, demanding that they surrender anyone they were hiding. Thomas met them at the door, rifle in hand, but not raised. He told them they would find only family inside. The men didn't believe him. They forced their way through the house, overturning furniture, smashing dishes, searching every corner for hidden spaces. When Mary tried to block the cellar stairs, she was struck. Ruth wrote that she had never seen Thomas so close to violence. His finger trembled on the trigger before he finally lowered the weapon and ordered the men out. They found nothing. Caroline and Samuel had been warned 2 days earlier and had temporarily moved to Philadelphia. But before leaving, the raid's leader, a mill owner named Hutchins, issued a final warning. If the family continued harboring black people or assisting their settlement in any way, there would be consequences far beyond simple property damage. The following week, Thomas met with other network members. Together, they made the painful decision to suspend operations. The risk had simply become too great, especially for families with children. 3 conductors had been killed in Virginia the previous month. The network couldn't continue functioning if maintaining it meant orphaning children or widowing spouses. But they agreed on one thing: the network wouldn't disappear entirely. They would maintain their connections, keep their symbols visible, and wait for safer times. Thomas argued that the work was generational. What they couldn't complete, their children would continue. For Samuel and Caroline, the raids accelerated a transition that had become inevitable. Caroline had saved enough to rent a small cottage in Philadelphia. She had secured steady employment with Quaker abolitionists who paid fair wages and offered to help pay for Samuel's schooling. On February 28, 1880, Ruth described the farewell. The Whitmore children were all weeping. Mary held onto Samuel until the wagon was finally ready. Thomas gave him a small Bible with his name inscribed inside. Ruth gave Caroline a quilt with the beacon pattern stitched into its corners. It was both a gift and a reminder of the network that had brought them all together. Samuel asked if he would ever see them again. Thomas promised that he would. Family, he said, didn't end just because of distance. As the wagon pulled away, Samuel leaned out and kept waving until he disappeared from view. Ruth wrote that Caroline never looked back, perhaps because it would have hurt too much. The house felt achingly empty after they left, but Thomas reminded her that Samuel was alive, safe, reunited with his mother, and educated. That was victory. That was what they had fought for all along. Ruth's diary continued for 9 more years, documenting family life, the surrounding community, slow acceptance, gradual healing. But after that day, she never mentioned Samuel again by name, at least not until Marcus discovered what happened next. Marcus left Havford with photocopies of 47 diary pages and one burning question. What actually happened to Samuel after 1880? A 9-year-old with that kind of resilience, that intelligence. Raised by 2 families who genuinely loved him. That child must have left some mark on the world. He returned to Philadelphia and began painstaking historical research. Census records, city directories, church registries, school logs, death certificates, property deeds. Marcus worked through databases until his eyes burned, following threads that led nowhere, hitting dead ends, starting over from scratch every time. The main challenge was Samuel's last name. The Whitmores had never formally adopted him, and Caroline's enslaved surname was almost certainly her owner's name, one she might have changed after emancipation. Marcus searched every variation he could think of. Samuel Whitmore, Samuel Caroline, Samuel Freeman, Samuel Liberty, names that formerly enslaved people commonly chose for themselves. 3 weeks later, Marcus finally found a reference in Pennsylvania Abolition Society records. A June 1885 letter from a Quaker educator named Elizabeth Morris described her school's most promising student, a 14-year-old named Samuel Wright who had arrived in Philadelphia 5 years earlier with his mother, Caroline Wright. The letter noted Samuel's previous rural education and his exceptional aptitude for mathematics and mechanical drawing. Elizabeth was requesting scholarship funds so he could attend technical school. Marcus's hands shook as he photographed the letter. He cross-referenced and found Samuel Wright listed in the 1885 Philadelphia Directory as a student at the Morris School for Colored Youth. The 1890 census showed him at age 19, employed as a draftsman at a machine manufacturing company. The trail only grew stronger from there. By 1895, Samuel had become a certified engineer, one of fewer than 20 black professional engineers in the entire state of Pennsylvania. He had married a teacher named Grace, and they had 2 children together. The 1900 census listed him in a middle-class black neighborhood, owning his own home, earning a comfortable income. But what truly captured Marcus's attention was a brief notice in the 1903 Philadelphia Tribune. A short article announced Samuel Wright's promotion to chief engineer at Baldwin Locomotive Works, one of America's largest industrial manufacturers. The article noted that this was unprecedented, the company's first black chief engineer. The accompanying photograph showed a confident man in his early 30s wearing a suit and wire-rimmed glasses, standing proudly beside a massive locomotive engine. Marcus zoomed in, searching for any trace of the frightened 6-year-old who had once walked 30 miles completely alone. And there it was, barely visible, a small pin on Samuel's lapel, 3 interlocking diamonds, the beacon. He had never stopped carrying it. Marcus spent 2 months assembling Samuel Wright's complete life story, piecing together fragments from newspapers, engineering journals, church records, and family histories. What emerged was an extraordinary story of achievement built on the love of two families. Samuel graduated from technical school in 1891 at age 20. He was the only black student in his entire class. His thesis on improving steam engine efficiency was actually published in an engineering journal, gaining attention from major manufacturers. Baldwin Locomotive Works hired him as a junior draftsman, a position typically closed to black applicants. But his work was simply too exceptional to ignore. Over the next 12 years, he rose through the company, repeatedly encountering barriers, but consistently producing designs that improved locomotive performance and safety. By 1903, as chief engineer, he held 7 patents related to locomotive manufacturing. But Samuel's achievements extended far beyond professional success. He and Grace opened their home to children from struggling families, providing them with education and support. Between 1898 and 1915, they helped over 30 children attend school, find apprenticeships, and eventually establish themselves in skilled trades. In 1910, Samuel published a memoir titled Two Mothers, One Journey. The book documented his experiences being raised by both Caroline and the Whitmores, his observations about racial injustice, and his firm belief that real change required both black excellence and white allies who were willing to sacrifice their own comfort for the sake of justice. The book was considered too controversial for any major publisher, so it was printed instead by a small black-owned press. Marcus managed to obtain a digitized copy from the Library of Congress. Reading Samuel's words in his own voice was an overwhelming experience. Samuel described arriving at the Whitmore farm in vivid, painful detail. His fear, his exhaustion, Ruth's gentle hands cleaning his infected feet, learning to trust again, Mary teaching him his letters, Thomas showing him how to repair fences, while explaining that work done well was a form of dignity in itself. But he also wrote about reuniting with Caroline, describing it as living underwater your whole life, and then suddenly breaking the surface into air. He acknowledged the profound complexity of loving two families, the guilt he sometimes felt about being happy with the Whitmores while his mother was still out there searching, the confusion about where he truly belonged. Samuel's solution, in the end, was simple. He didn't have to choose. Both families had given him different gifts. The Whitmores had given him education, safety, and the understanding that white people could indeed be allies in the struggle for justice. Caroline had given him identity, a connection to his history, and proof that love could survive even the most brutal separation and trauma. He carried both of those gifts forward throughout his life, using his engineering skills to create opportunities for other black professionals while maintaining contact with the Whitmore family until his dying day. The memoir included letters exchanged between Samuel and Mary well into adulthood, discussing politics, social change, and shared memories of their childhood together. Samuel Wright died in 1932 at age 61 from pneumonia. His obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune described him as a pioneering engineer, a community leader, and a living example of what Black Americans could achieve when given the opportunity. Hundreds of people attended his funeral, including 3 of the Whitmore grandchildren. Marcus sat with all of this information for days afterward, emotionally exhausted and profoundly moved by what he had uncovered. But one question still remained. What had happened to the original photograph? How had it ended up in that attic, seemingly forgotten by everyone? The answer led him to the final piece of the puzzle. The estate sale had been for a woman named Dorothy Hughes, who had died at age 87 with no living children. Marcus obtained her death certificate and traced her family lineage backward. Dorothy was born Dorothy Whitmore in 1936. She was the great-granddaughter of Thomas and Ruth, descended through their daughter Mary. the same Mary who had taught Samuel to read, defended him during that violent raid, and maintained lifelong correspondence with him. The house that was being demolished had once been Mary's house, built in 1868 and passed down through her family line for generations. Dorothy had been the very last living descendant. The photograph had traveled from the original Whitmore farm to Mary's house after Thomas and Ruth passed away. It had been kept as a family treasure for generations. But somewhere along the way, its true meaning had been lost. Dorothy's children, interviewed after Marcus managed to contact them, knew absolutely nothing about Samuel or the family's abolitionist activities. The photograph had become just an old picture to them. Tucked away and eventually forgotten, its radical message completely invisible to people who had never learned how to look for it. Marcus made a decision. He reached out to Samuel Wright's descendants, who were still living in Philadelphia, and arranged a meeting. The gathering took place on a Sunday afternoon in March 2024, almost exactly 149 years after that original photograph had been taken. Samuel's great-grandson, James Wright, a high school history teacher, opened the door of his home to let them in. 15 family members had assembled for the occasion. Marcus placed the photograph down on the table. A profound silence settled over the room. James Wright picked it up carefully, his hands trembling slightly. He had heard stories growing up about Samuel, spending time with a white family, but he had never seen any proof. And now here was his own ancestor as a child, standing together with the people who had saved his life and shaped his entire future. A woman in her 70s, Samuel's great-granddaughter, pointed to the symbol on the sleeve. She explained that Samuel had passed down the beacon symbol to all of his children, teaching them that it represented safe harbor and resistance. Her own grandmother had embroidered that same pattern into a quilt that was still hanging in her living room to this day. Marcus spent 3 hours sharing everything he had found. Ruth's diary entries, newspaper articles documenting Samuel's achievements, drawing the connections between that terrified 6-year-old refugee and the chief engineer, community leader, and author he eventually became. The family made a decision together. They would donate the photograph to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, along with Samuel's memoir and all of Marcus's documentation. It would become part of an exhibition about how the Underground Railroad continued after the Civil War, about families who resisted injustice at tremendous personal cost, and about a child who carried the legacy of 2 mothers forward into a life of remarkable achievement and service. Before Marcus left that day, James Wright thanked him for bringing Samuel home. Marcus simply shook his head. Samuel had never really been lost, he said. His legacy lived on in the family who still remembered him, in the lives he had touched, in the children he had helped, in the work he had accomplished. The photograph had just been waiting, all those years, for someone to finally zoom in and see what had always been there. Evidence that love could cross every boundary society ever tried to erect. That courage could be quiet and persistent. That ordinary people could choose to commit extraordinary acts of defiance. And that one child, saved by the compassion of strangers and reclaimed by the fierce devotion of his mother, could go on to change the world. The symbol on Samuel's sleeve, those 3 interlocking diamonds, had meant safe harbor back in 1875. Nearly 150 years later, it still meant exactly the same thing. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, some people choose to be light, and their choices echo forward, generation after generation, long after photographs fade and names are forgotten. Some secrets are not meant to stay hidden forever. Some stories simply demand to be told, and this was one of them.